All right, thank you, Ellen. It is a deep and heartening pleasure to be back with Temple Sinai of Cinnamon once again, um, especially for a few reasons. One, you all are a highly engaged audience in social and political affairs in our country in a very moral way. Of course, much of that is a testament to your integration and your learning with your Jewish congregation at Temple Sinai. And so this is certainly a highly appropriate audience to be able to uh, talk through, discuss, and analyze issues of great political importance that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is going to focus on not necessarily the best news, which is political extremism. So I've buttered you up a little bit as an audience, I guess. I suppose I can stop with that, but I do want to say, again, an honor to be invited, especially for a multi-part series. It would be an honor just once, and so I hope we can learn together. And I know I can sometimes yap on a good amount, so I'm going to consciously try. I will try to consciously watch the clock and do this a little bit under an hour so we can have plenty of time to discuss this because it can be more dynamic as a discussion than me just talking at you. Okay, but there's some a fair amount of material to get through, and I'll try to summarize it hopefully efficiently and well. As Ellen mentioned, this is the first of a three-part series. Now we were together, what, about 5 months or so ago, back in May, back spring, early summertime, and we talked about the realignment of the Republican Party, the Republican electorate, registered Republican voters towards a more extreme ideology of nationalism. That there was a growing nationalist presence among the Republican electorate, right of center political spectrum across the United States. And we've seen that percentage of extremism among registered Republican voters fairly consistently growing, especially over the past 5-6 years. We didn't necessarily have a lot of time because that was a big topic to get into some of the more specifics of some of the different avenues that we covered about why that realignment was occurring and how it was occurring. And so that's what we're going to do in this three-part series that includes this evening, a session in December, and a session in January. So just very briefly before we begin tonight, this session here we're calling a complete conspiracy. We're going to look at and focus on the understanding the principles, and yes, there are foundational principles of this nationalist extremist ideology and the belief set of that portion, and it's a sizable portion, unfortunately, of right of spectrum voters that hold these sort of nationalist beliefs. So we're going to go through the belief set, the foundational principles of that, and try to understand it as an extremist ideology. We're also going to show the media sources that give these voters their talking points and sort of mimic their belief sets that center around a sort of set of conspiracy issues that they hold to. In December, on December 2nd, our second session, about a little over a month from now, we'll do a growing conspiracy. That's going to look at, okay, so political extremism on the right is a growing problem. How big is it? How big is the scope of it? So we're going to, in that session, we're going to go through, I'll walk you through some polling data, some of the best evidence that we have recently across the U.S. population and right of center registered voters about their belief sets. It should logically follow from this, from understanding the beliefs from this session we have this evening. We'll sort of connect that with the data next time, and I'll also bring in more of my my own interview data. I've done, I have multiple years of interview data across right of center voters, right of center political spectrum voters, especially nationalists and conspiracy belief voters. And so I'll bring in some of my interview evidence as well to sort of supplement the polling data to show how big, what the scale of this issue is and what percentage of the Republican Party is nationalist and believe these specific sets of convictions and beliefs and opinions. Finally, then in January 27th, we are going to do a solvable conspiracy ? So hopefully that session especially will be a more practical exercise. I'm going to bring with you and we will discuss hopefully practical potential solutions or ways to decrease political extremism on right of center spectrum. So especially, with interpersonal relations, I imagine Some of you, either in your family, either through acquaintances or friend networks, maybe for those of you that are working, colleagues as well, or people you just meet around everyday life that hold these beliefs. How can you talk to people to try to convince them, to move away from right-wing authoritarianism and to try to decrease this as a problem in your interpersonal relationships? So we'll look at some strategies for that, and then we will also, maybe as a minor part of that session, look at policy solutions at the federal and state level that could be supported and advocated for as well. So hopefully this will all chain together fairly well, starting this evening with looking at the belief set and the media consumption and media sources that constitute the beliefs of the growing nationalism within the Republican Party. So let me bring up here, I just need a few seconds when I transition between my screens here. The title of the talk here, A Complete Conspiracy, QAnon and Political Beliefs of U.S. Nationalists. So again, we're going to go through this belief set. Let's just review our terms really quickly, because we may have some terms here that we need a little bit of reminder about what they mean, because we're not necessarily used to them in our politics, but they've become more newsworthy and more known, I think, especially within the past year and a half. Nationalism. Now, I use the term nationalist a lot in my titles and referring to the people I interview and referring to the demographic groups that we're talking about. Again, to be specific, we are focusing on what is now a decent-sized percentage and proportion of registered Republican voters across the United States. I think through all of the data we have, we can accurately define them as holding a nationalist type of political beliefs and ideology, okay? Nationalism, just a brief definition, political science definition, is the belief that the nation state is the ultimate and paramount actor in geopolitics and domestic politics. And that nationalists believe then that national unity is paramount also, because you have to support the nation state fully in its ventures abroad and domestically. And therefore, nationalism is considered historically an extremist ideology because of the outcomes and also because of the belief set. And it also then can lead to, and has historically led to oftentimes, the most extreme form of right side politics, which is fascism. And fascism is when nationalism grows into, well, we need the national unity, but we have subgroups within our population that don't agree with us on politics, so we have to either seriously repress them or even potentially get rid of them. Okay, so so nationalism can certainly sometimes and has historically led into fascism. We have historical precedents for this, right? Nationalism is nothing new. It has a decently long historical track record. I'm going to occasionally refer tonight, when we look at the principles and beliefs of U.S. nationalists, I'm going to refer to the two historical examples of nationalism and fascism that we are probably most familiar with in the West. And that is the original nationalism and fascism, the origins of it, which is Italian nationalism. That's Mussolini's Italy. Back in the, it sort of grew out of an ideology of the late 1800s into the early and into the 1900s, World War I and after. And then also a significant copy of that, and the case we certainly historically most likely know most, and that is the nationalism and fascism of Germany. And of course, that was eventually Hitler's Nazi Germany between World War I and World War II. So nationalism is nothing new. And what I'm hopefully going to show you tonight as well, through looking at the principles and beliefs and the media sources that feed this, that this ideology we're looking at in the United States has a lot of corollaries, a lot of correlations and comparisons with Italian fascism, German fascism of the early 20th century. Those ideologies, like almost all nationalist and fascist movements that have ever existed, are actually based on conspiracy type of beliefs. This is really exotic to us in the recent day United States. We're not used to dealing with these sorts of beliefs, but it is not necessarily anything new to extremist political movements. So we're going to do a little bit of comparison as well. The other thing that may be a little bit unfamiliar to you, but if some of you are news savvy, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it more recently, the term there on the screen from our photo. By the way, the photo is, of course, a picture here of inside an arena for a rally for the what has become the main figurehead of the nationalist movement, and of course, that's the former president, Donald Trump. And you see here that the on the billboard there, the sign the young man is holding, QAnon, biggest intel drop in our history. So QAnon stands for Q Anonymous. This represents the media sources and the media outlets and the media consumption of nationalist voters, okay? Now, this has maybe a longer history than you think. QAnon actually predates the start of the nationalist realignment of the Republican Party that started in 2015, 2016. QAnon actually goes back almost a decade. It has its roots in the early 2010s, back when social media and the internet was on the internet was getting more fully formed and getting going and getting more audiences. We're not necessarily sure of which individuals and or entities were posting as Q, but there were these series of posts on message boards and discussion forums on various social media outlets online, some of them in the darker spots of the internet, if you will, but still got, thousands and tens of thousands of views. A person or entities were posting as this anonymous person named that they call themselves Q. Okay, we're not necessarily sure what the Q means, but they use the term Q. Okay. They made themselves out to be and claimed to be a high-ranking intelligence official and or military officer in the U.S. government, and they were they were portraying themselves as posting intelligence about an evil elite, a conspiratorial elite that was running the world and that was controlling basically all of the political events and social unrest that occurred around the world and also in the United States. And this is the origins then. I oftentimes in my titles and in these talks, I've referred to QAnon and associated sources. What grew out of QAnon then is what is now a large, very large online ecosystem of media sources and media outlets, some of them smaller scale, some of them now larger scale, that have sort of they started with these sort of QAnon conspiracy beliefs and have extended them. And now, even though this Q entity is no longer actively posting anymore and posting intelligence news, quote unquote, and all of that stuff and these conspiracy beliefs, there is now literally hundreds of thousands of websites. And at the height of the YouTube channels, before YouTube started cracking down on right-wing extremism, there were literally thousands of YouTube channels. Now there are thousands of video channels on other channels, sites independent of YouTube. There are literally hundreds of thousands of these sites now promoting nationalist conspiracy beliefs. So it has its origin in QAnon. So when we talk about what nationalists are consuming media-wise, we are talking about the associated sources of what was originally QAnon, QAnon as an actual source. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. That's what we're talking about here as far as where they get their, again, quote unquote, news and the belief sets that they mimic and constitute many of the things that the nationalists will talk about and believe. Okay, some pictures here before we get into listing the 5 principles of this ideology, and then also the looking at some of the media sources that I'll share with you, some of the most prominent ones. We have here a young woman. This is a picture outside of a beginning of what's going to be a Donald Trump rally recently, and we see here her version of being awakened to the truth. Woke. This may be a term, if you follow the news, that is has been very popular recently on the left side of the political spectrum. The idea of becoming awakened to the truth or waking up to some sort of truth that was otherwise secretly hidden from you. Now, on the left side of the spectrum, this has taken this oftentimes focuses on understanding issues, legitimate issues, of course, around understanding ethnic discrimination against certain minority groups and also things like police brutality, which are, of course, legitimate issues. The right has their version of wokeism, too. You see it here on the shirt here. This is actually, you see it a fair amount on some of the websites, the term woke being used, but here we have the Q instead of the O. And so it's, QAnon awakening to that conspiracy truth. That again, there is, and we will specify these beliefs here in a few minutes, of course, but again, that there is a evil cabal of elites, mostly Democratic Party politicians at both the federal and state level, federal bureaucrats that run the federal agencies in Washington, D.C., and also some what they call rhinos, Republicans in name only, Republican elected officials that are not fully on board with the nationalist belief set, that are part of this evil cabal that is running the world secretly. And so the people now have, nationalists have, they've awakened to this through their QAnon sources, telling them this truth, QAnon posting the intelligence about what's really going on in the world. And so it is this idea, it's almost a religious idea in a way, of sort of, for the first time ever, we have seen the truth, and this is it. And those news sources that we can trust that are parroting what we think, they're the ones that are actually telling us the truth, the real world about how the world works. And so, again, we see that sort of wokeism here, but a right side version of it. Understand too, as we go through this, I think you'll see a few points of this in the discussion this evening. The extreme left and the extreme right are starting to merge on a few different issues. Not only using similar terms and similar sort of, occasionally authoritarian type of methods, but they're also merging on again some of the use of these terms again like wokeism and those sorts of things. So there's a sort of circling around between the extremes going on, and so we'll have a few more points of that as we go along. Stop normalizing pedophilia. Now, look, a lot of these I do give a disclaimer here. This is an extremist conspiracy ideology we're going to be showing examples of. I'm not going to be showing you any, very rough photos or anything. It's not going to be anything you can't look at, of course. It's nothing in graphic form too extreme. The rhetoric is going to be extreme, though, in some senses. I just want to sort of disclaimer that before we start. It's not going to be anything too really, really bad. But there is this widespread idea among nationalists that not only is it an evil elite running the world, but they also practice things occasionally like child molestation. Now, I know that's a very wild thing to talk about, obviously intensely far, not even close to any sort of reality, but it is a part of the belief set, and we will talk about that. So you see that they're represented on the sign along with the QAnon referencing the wokeism and those sorts of things. And one more picture here before we get into starting to talk more about the principles of the ideology and all that. We see here on the screen, and by the way, I'm pulling these photos from the internet. I do field work and do interviews among nationalist voters myself. Given the conspiracy belief set that a lot of those folks have, you can rightly understand that they don't necessarily want their photos taken very much during field work. I generally don't try to do photos of informants when I do my field work, so I unfortunately cannot just to keep their anonymity. As I do my own studies, cannot really rightly show those photos in a public setting. But so I did, pull these as sort of representative of nationalist voters from various internet sources. I pulled this one for a specific reason too, just as a factoid beyond what we're going to see here with the QAnon thing. We see here a sort of young lady, most likely, maybe early teenage, mid-teenage years, maybe even younger than that, certainly below 18 years of age. Holding a Great Q Awakening sign, right? Again, representing this as part of the ideology. This is outside a street protest for the national street protest. We have likely a older male relative here with a Trump support sign, and so we see this theme again, right? Being awakened to some sort of conspiratorial truth. And again, that's why it's a conspiracy, because it's been secret to us. I'm talking now like, from a nationalist perspective. And so, we're being awakened to this and seeing this for the first time, and this is the truth that's been hidden from us for our entire lives. And it references, of course, QAnon there as well, the Great Q Awakening. I show a few of these. If you look at this picture and the previous one, I would note and I would submit to all of you, if you look at, you see the young man holding the QAnon sign there in the previous photo, we see some young folks here, don't we? I would submit to you that if you look at recent, since his presidency and afterward, Donald Trump rallies that represent a lot of these nationalist voters, there's a growing set of younger people, meaning early 20s or even 18 years and below children that are attending these rallies. Just as a hopefully interesting factoid before we get into the belief system here, we have, as political scientists and social scientists, going back to the mid-20th century, we do a lot of surveys across the U.S. population about measuring political extremism, and not only political extremist beliefs, but also how people of one party feel about people of another party, how Democrats feel about Republicans, and back and forth and all of that. We also have a consistent year-over-year measuring of children's beliefs regarding these things, meaning 13 to 17-year-olds, basically, what do they think about people of the other party? What do they learn from their parents about this? Do they have positive or negative beliefs? All these sorts of things, and they measure very similar to about the same things between the adults and the children. For the first time, 2020 and 2021, this past year, for the first time of over 50 years of data, it's been consistent for decades. Every single time this has been done, and this is logical, adults tend to be much more negative partisanship than children, meaning that we tend to see a lot more Republicans feeling negative about Democrats and Democrats feeling negative about Republicans among adults than we do among children. You would expect, political partisanship to harden over time, right? And so it generally has been for decades. All the data we have on this, that the adults have been significantly more partisan than the kids. That is no longer the case, I'm sorry to say. For the first time this past year, the kids are now polling as negatively partisanship as the adults on both the Republican and Democratic side. We are teaching this to our kids. Now, I don't, of course, when I'm a social scientist, I say we, and our, I'm obviously not referring to, of course, you all in the audience. You all are a moral and upstanding audience, of course. I'm talking about society-wide. I'm making big brush statements here, okay, as a sociologist and studying large social trends. But we are, when we look at the large U.S. population, this is getting into our kids. Children mimic, right? They don't even have to be explicitly taught it, although that is certainly occurring when we look at some of the data. We are seeing children mimicking this. We are seeing children going to the rallies. We are seeing children, especially teenage years, getting caught up on this quite early. The reason why I say this before we continue is that this is likely now, because of this, assuming that stays fairly consistent, this is going to be a multi-generational problem almost certainly, meaning growing extremism among especially the right side of the spectrum. So when we talk about this as a serious problem and the scope of the problem, this is likely something we are going to be dealing with for a long time and possibly even multiple generations if it is ingrained this early. So we're going to have to deal with that. Okay. Just a second here. I'm going to switch up a slide here. So let's talk about, I'm going to go through 5 sort of foundational beliefs that constitute this ideology. And then as we go through these slides, there are going to be 3 or 4 of them. I'm going to show you media outlets that constitute a lot of the media consumption that represent each of these sort of principles or beliefs. Okay, and hopefully that'll give you then a good idea about, what are nationalists reading? What does that look like? What are the internet sources? Where are they getting this information from, and what is the nature of it? Understand too that media consumption has gone much online. I don't necessarily want to take up too much time, but there is good data out there, especially from Pew, which is a major national and international survey organization that looks at political beliefs across the country. They do a lot of good samples. And it shows consistently that since the early 2010s, there's been a consistent uptick in internet news consumption. Also among college students too, not just among, mid-20s and beyond, even young people as well. Most news consumption now occurs online. It is no longer just MSNBC and Fox News and CNN and the Washington Post and New York Times and so on and so forth, although that still does represent a decent chunk. If we want to understand nationalist ideology, we have to understand the internet sources, because that's where 65 to 70+% of it is coming from, given the daily and weekly consumption habits of people that believe it, okay? And that's what I'm going to take you through, of course, this evening, is that. One more thing here about this. I've consistently, I think maybe the word I've used the most so far is ideology, right? Political ideology, political movement, describing this proportion of the Republican electorate that are nationalists. For those of you that have been, this is a set of issues that's gotten a lot of media play recently, right? You turn on your major news outlets or you read, your major newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, so forth, which I'm sure many of you do. The QAnon sources, portraying the politicians that communicated, all this sort of stuff is oftentimes in the news, especially on the news networks, a daily dose of it. If you watch that stuff, a lot of the ways that this is portrayed is they call it a cult, right? Quote unquote. You probably heard that term a fair amount if you followed this in the news. Those that follow nationalist ideology constitute a cult of Donald Trump, who is the proposed former leader of this. I want to try to argue with you that that is the wrong way to look at this. This is not a cult. It is an extremist political ideology, and there's a huge difference between those two things. Very briefly, what is a cult? A cult is when you have a leader and followers that slavishly follow a leader, meaning that there are numerous historical examples, of course, Jonestown, many others, where literally every single thing the leader says and does is mimicked nearly completely, 99, 100% by all of the followers, okay? To the point that it's almost to the point that the leader literally has these people, almost literally eating out of their hand. Donald Trump does get critiqued by the nationalist right sometimes. There was a recent rally where he was booed for, actually proposing that people get the COVID vaccine. I can show you some of these extremist right-wing sources, nationalist sources that actually have critical articles occasionally of Donald Trump. This is not a cult. The other reason why we want to understand it as an ideology is because, and hopefully I'll show this to you with the principles and beliefs, is that it really does mimic historical examples of nationalism and fascism. It has a set of conspiracy beliefs that international forces and domestic forces and groups against the real people are conspiring against them. That was very much the basis of Mussolini's nationalism in Italy, that the Mediterranean state and the Mediterranean race of Italians would go and take back Croatia and Malta and all of these other places outside of Italy proper to reclaim the rightful land of the Mediterranean race against the evil internationalist and domestic forces that were working against the real Italians. German nationalism, the idea that World War I, the pummeling of Germany in World War I was an international conspiracy of other nations, other European nations, and the West, and eventually the United States against the German race. And of course, unfortunately, I don't have to tell you, of course, unfortunately, that ended up into obviously the worst cases of anti-Semitism in human history. And of course, that conspiratorial set of beliefs that German nationalists and fascists held, which is that there was an international and domestic Jewish conspiracy against the German people, right? So if we start to look at it that way, I submit to you that this is going to it'll become clearer, hopefully, that this is actually a coherent political ideology. It has actual policy wants, and it has the rhetoric to try to violently or through other extra-legal means try to achieve that, which is what all nationalist and fascist movements have tried to do before. So I really want to emphasize, this is, it's portrayed in the media as a cult a lot, but I think, and the other reason why we don't want to think about it that way, I would say, is because that also makes us think, when we hear the term cult, we think of, we think psychotic, right? Perhaps, initially. We think, well, then these people are crazy. Now, I know the belief set is highly far from reality, of course, and it gets really wild, and we'll see examples of that. But when we look at the movement as filled with psychotics, there is a rationality here to it, even though it's a sort of morbid rationality. There is a will to power among nationalists, and they have a strategy to take power, and we've even seen some of that, unfortunately, play out a little bit in our public life this past year as well. So this is an ideology, not a cult. So to summarize it here, and then we'll go through the principles, to just sort of give the shorthand taxi cab ride summary, if you will, if you had to summarize it in a sentence or something. And then, by the way, I'm going to use terms that nationalists themselves use in their media and in their and in their news outlets and just in how they talk. And this is from my own interview data that I have as well, regularly used sort of terms. We always, as anthropologists and sociologists, we always want to ideally use the native language, if you will. So we're going to use the language of nationalists here. They use, so I'll use the native terms in quotes, okay? Patriots, and by the way, these terms you've probably seen in news coverage of this as well, maybe occasionally. Patriots are true patriots, those that are devoted to the nationalist cause, patriotic Americans. Patriots can fight and defeat, through violence or through extra-legal means or both, and defeat the evil conspiracy to bring about a utopia. A utopia is also part of extremist ideology of any form, both right of center and left of center. Again, the big historical examples of this, Italian nationalism was about bringing about the pan-Italian, large Southern European, Mediterranean, large Italian state. Of course, more clearly, the German nationalism was about, bringing about the utopia of an Aryan, pure German, pure white German state. We could even take, authoritarian socialism from the days of the Soviet Union. The true people, the true Russians, the proletariat would rise up against the conspiring kulaks, the land-owning class, the upper middle and upper class, and expel them from the country or worse, to be able to bring about the socialist utopia where the workers would unite and the workers would live in harmony among each other, and they would then have equality, and we would live in that, they would live in that harmony for eternity. Utopian vision. U.S. nationalists have a similar type of utopian vision, and that's what we're going to talk about too. Okay, so just a few principles here. Then I'll show you. We'll start to get into the media sources, and I'll share my screen with that. So just to sort of build this up logically, or as logically as we can. So foundational principle here, and I say principle is something that these are the foundations of what then are the base for all of the more specific political and policy beliefs, okay? A group of elites, what they call also more extremely the cabal, conspire and partially secretly run the world, including the United States, politically and economically. I just need to move my screen here just a second so I can see everything, and cause or are responsible for most major events from the global to the local level. So there is now, what constitutes to nationalists the evil elite? From all we can glean from polling data and my own interview data, it seems to be the following. It seems to be Democratic Party affiliated politicians at the federal level and a good amount at the state level as well. Federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. That are employed in and especially running the various major federal agencies, U.S. Department of Education, Department of Energy, so on and so forth. And then also, this would also include, by the way, some Republicans, federally elected Republican officials, and also some state Republican officials, what they call, again, that term, that acronym RINOs, R-I-N-O, which stands for Republican in name only. These would be the more pre-2015 ideology Republicans, the more, what we would call classic liberal or sort of, open economy, maybe socially conservative, but certainly pro-democracy, of course, Republicans. Some federal examples of that would be like Senator Mitt Romney, Senator Ben Sasse, Lisa Murkowski, if you follow the news. And so these would be called, these are people that are consistently called RINOs, okay, by nationalists. And so they are people that are not in on the national unity. They're not in on the, the full belief system here. And so they are also a part of this cabal that nationalists need to and want to get rid of. Okay, and so that's what. So when we look at it that way, we're likely talking about what nationalists are identifying as, this could be up to tens of thousands of people. It is a large chunk of what we consider sort of the establishment, if you will, of our elected officials and people that essentially are in government or run the federal and some state governments too. Okay, couple other things here. Most elected officials then across most levels of government, again, I'm mimicking the nationalist belief system here, and appointed federal bureaucrats, this is kind of what I was just saying, This is what the federal bureaucracy and the elected officials, including some on the Republican side, are what are called the establishment, or even more pejoratively, the swamp, okay? And the swamp mimicking the Washington, D.C. used to, you know, environmentally be a swamp, so I think that's where that term comes from. They are part of, they constitute this evil elite that are running things, okay? Again, constituting this cabal of conspiratorial elites that are running things. Now, this also, of course, plays into conspiracies about Jewish as well, unfortunately. Unfortunately, Jewish populations are, historically, this is nothing new. Much of this ideology, the conspiracy parts of it, are really amalgamations or aggregations of historical conspiracies about, again, a sort of Illuminati, or the sort of group that sits above everybody else. Heads of corporations, big business, also a part of this as well, running the world secretly, that the people don't necessarily fully know about, and so these sorts of things. The Rothschild family, it plays very much into this set of conspiracies as well. The longtime banking family from Central and Western Europe. George Soros, Hungarian Jewish individual, of course, philanthropic, person, it plays into this as well, and he's also a big figure in this ideology about being a part and sort of sometimes even leading the evil cabal here. Okay, and so only outsiders then, because this is basically the entire U.S. government in this belief system, only outsiders then can deter this or stop this. People in government can't. Hopefully here we can see, and again, I'll show some examples in a couple minutes here, how this then leads to violence and extra legal means that people legitimate should be done. Because when people believe that almost all or all of federal government constitutes an evil elite, ordinary citizens have to rise up and get rid of it somehow or deal with it. And so only outsiders then can deter this and stop this in this ideology, and elections and voting can't solve all of this evil in these circles either. So again, this is where the violence comes in, unfortunately. This is where the citizen, the going against legal proceedings, these sorts of things. We see more, an increase in political action that is sort of through extra legal means recently as well. And so this is what is fueling that, because it's, again, the belief system that you have to take things into your own hands, essentially. Let me show you. I'm going to switch screens. Give me a second. I'm going to show you some examples of the media outlets here. I'm going to bring up my browser. Give me just a second, and I'll show you some of the most read and most consumed nationalist websites. So hopefully, Ellen, can I get a nod that you can see this on your screen? Okay, excellent. Just a second, let me remove the ads down here. So this is what we're looking at here. Hopefully you can see it. I'll read through some of it because it's probably a little bit of small print. TheLibertyDaily.com. The Liberty Daily, all one word.com. Now, what I'm going to show you here, these are fairly high consumed, high traffic websites, okay? This is a news aggregator. I don't know if any of you are familiar with like the AP Newswire or Real Clear Politics or those sorts of things. But those are what we call news aggregators, meaning that they bring in news stories from various other sources, and they basically amalgamate them, aggregate them in one site. Okay, so that's what the Liberty Daily is, a nationalist news aggregator. By the way, just for just to understand how many people are looking at these sorts of things, we'll look at ones that are bigger. But the Liberty Daily has anywhere from hundreds of thousands of views per month to millions per every few months. Okay, so it's a widely read sort of thing. Let me give you some examples here. Let's see. Children in ICUs by over 33,000%. This is talking about COVID situation. What do we have here? Sorry, this one actually changes a lot. It reloads, so I looked at some of the things, but now they're a little bit different. Laugh out loud, Mark Zuckerberg announces he's rebranding fascist book as Meta. You know, he was talking about rebranding Facebook, so fascist book. There's a lot of ad hominem attacks here, okay, you know, very extremist sort of rhetoric. Let me see some other examples here. Democrat Andrew Cuomo charged with sex crime. That's the very, you know, stupid sort of looking photo of, you know, the person shocked and all of that. Wisconsin sheriff shows massive voter fraud in nursing home helped steal 2020 election. This idea of a conspiracy about the 2020 election, right? That, you know, there's a patriot, a sheriff, you know, one of the true patriots in Wisconsin, who was, bringing about, you know, the reality, the awakening of the 2020 election, that it was stolen from us and Donald Trump. Illinois reports 77.7% of its COVID deaths last week were vaccinated. You know, so much of this stuff, of course, is just literally made up. It does not have any basis, much of it in any truth, of course. But you start to see the extremist political rhetoric here. Maybe a couple more. You know, what else? We have, you see some of the advertisements as well. Let's see, Joe Rogan expresses support for free speech platforms, Rumble, which is a sort of right of center sort of extremist site, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you can start to see here, and again, this is one of the more highly visited news aggregators that nationalists use. Let me show you another one that maybe would surprise you a little bit, at least from some of the content. News aggregators and nationalist news sites there's such a large ecosystem that it gets into niche audiences as well. What you see on your screen here is Natural News, naturalnews.com, all one word. Now you hear a website like that, it's a name like that, maybe it sounds pretty legitimate if you didn't see the content yet, or you just heard the name of it. It sounds okay, maybe sounds legitimate. Defending health, life, and liberty, has an American flag there and a cross. So let me read. So this gets similar traffic as the Liberty Daily does, similar amount, I should say. This focuses on anti-medical establishment, anti-doctor, anti-vaccine, anti-pharmaceutical corporations, basically health and sort of health-related news that is that fits the nationalist belief system. I'll read a few things here. Now, this one gets more extreme even than the Liberty Daily. COVID swabs, meaning COVID tests, contain cancer chemical. Evergrande collapse risks global financial reset. This is another thing about the nationalist ideology. It sees a global reset coming, whereby the elite are going to mastermind this sort of hyperinflation, hyper-tax, economic sort of collapse, both nationally and globally, whereby afterwards, or during it, nationalists will have to fight them to bring about utopia. Okay, I know we're getting wild here, but that's, again, the ideology. FDA endorses murderous vaccine atrocities against children. Goodness, this is a horrid one. God's wrath will show no mercy. Vaccine re-education camps in America. Fake food shelves resemble North Korea. This is the one of the conspiracies that's fairly prominent. It was prominent among my interviewees when I've done my own field work, and prominent in some of the polling data we see as well, that there is a proportion of nationalists that do think that there is going to be that there's going to be a sort of this is wild sort of re-education camp like they have in China with the Uyghurs, that they're going to be put in camps. And these sorts of things is what the re-education camp rhetoric here is referring to. And no good nationalist website, I suppose, would be without the sort of conspiratorial thinking. They have a backup IP address to go to where the site also exists in case they get taken down by their domain provider. Talk about the deep conspiracy, right? I mean, it's even right there at the start, like, if the site goes down, here you go to the alternative site, that's the secret number, and you can still get our news fed to you. So you can see how deep the conspiracy thinking goes. Some other things here. FDA declares biological war on children with final sacrifice of the innocent. My goodness. I mean, this is, again, the deep and morbid conspiracies about, federal agencies going after not only adults but also children with vaccines that are somehow, not only in their not effective, but are actually used to weaken people or somehow be a negative, produce negative outcomes. These sorts of things. Maybe just one or two others. We see here, it's now refutable. COVID mass vaccinations proved to be a massive failure. Investigative reporter says government's aggressive COVID-19 vaccination campaign is a psyop. This is also a big thing among nationalists, that there is this really, that vaccination campaigns, COVID, other things, are some sort of, again, sort of deep conspiracy and even sort of some sort of psychological operation that are trying to weaken the American public into submitting to the deep state. So again, this stuff gets pretty wild. And again, a site like this literally gets millions of views, unfortunately. Okay, I've already broken my own rule. I think I'm about 50 minutes here in. So let me just show a few other examples of this. Finish up with the belief set, and then we will go to questions. Okay. Some other things here. I'm going to pull up. Let me see. I also talked about the Great Reset, right? So okay, so only outsiders can deter. Have to fight back against the evil establishment in the nationalist ideology to be able to bring about utopia. This is also, a part of this is the idea of the quote-unquote Great Reset, that there is going to be, again, what I described earlier, the economic elite of the world are coming together to basically formulate some sort of economic collapse in mass. And so this is another reason why people have to fight back against it. This is a news quote unquote site example of this type of story. This is from the RAIR Foundation, RAIR Foundation.com. It sort of makes itself try to look like a think tank, sort of nationalist think tank, if you will. And also I'll read the headline here: shocking glimpse into life after the Great Reset, World Economic Forum's sinister plans. And it actually has videos from the World Economic Forum. I'll sort of scroll down here. By the way, you see the date here. This was just from a little over a week ago, October 20th. Let me highlight the top here. The elites want to dictate every aspect of your life, from what you eat to where you go, down to how many times a week you are allowed to shower and wash your underwear. Okay, so we're getting really specific there. The elite are already controlling and are going to continue to more micromanage and control your life, right? So you have to push back against this. So it talks about the World Economic Forum leaders. Now, what's these, of course, it's far from reality stuff. It's kind of, it's a serious topic, of course, but it's also, I found it a little bit funny. What you see with some of these news stories is that they actually really do take some of the things from some of these sites that they're critiquing. And yet, I mean, even though some of them are not that unreasonable of things, it is the preconceived bias of the people reading them that makes them think that they are really extreme things. So for example, with this, the Great Reset involves, making smaller carbon footprint 3D printed homes. That's part of the Great Reset, quote unquote. How to, maybe using less water when you wash your clothes. That's a video. They're actually taking legitimate videos from the World Economic Forum sites, which, are not unreasonable things. Not everybody does it, of course, but they're then playing on the preconceived biases and ideology of the people reading these stories that then think, oh my goodness, this is just incredibly out there, incredibly extreme stuff. We have to fight against it. So that's sort of an example of that. Couple more things here. Now this one is, the one I'm about to show you is the most extreme version of things we're going to look at. It's called bitshoot.com. I give you a little bit of warning here. This has the most extreme rhetoric on it. This is a competition to YouTube. This is a video channel with video, a video site with video channels on it. People can post like they would post on YouTube. They have their channels and you can subscribe and all that sort of stuff. By the way, what we're going to look at here, BitChute gets basically 3 to 4 times the traffic of the previous sites we looked at. It is one of the most highly sought after and read and watched extreme right websites. It has 3 to 4 million visitors on average per month. That is not an insignificant number. Some of those are return visitors. Some of them are unique. Over its lifetime, it's had up to 40 to 50 million visitors. Okay. I'll scroll down here just to give you a sample of this. And again, I apologize because this one gets really extreme. Another great success for white well-being. You see here a channel with sort of white nationalism specifically. What else do we have here? CDC data confirms COVID vaccine deaths 2.5 times higher, more than all vaccines in history combined, or for past 30 years combined. We see here, we see some of the Donald Trump paraphernalia. What else? We see enslavement of the unvaxxed. They want civil war, world divided into two societies by world alternative media. Talk about the deep conspiracy state, right? This very much shows that as an example here. Banned on YouTube. You do not need to quarantine. Know your rights. Flying from a red zone country. So this is hotels using common law. This gets really conspiratorial, right? Quarantining is false. You don't need to do it. And by the way, I've been banned on YouTube and now I have to go to BitChute and all this sort of stuff. Okay, so let me show you one other example too, and then we'll stop with the media examples because again, I don't want to go on too long. BitChute, okay, so that is if we look at the web traffic that goes there, understand the proportion of the Republican Party that is nationalist. It is not all middle and lower middle class and lower class people on right wing of the spectrum. It also does constitute some of the upper middle class and upper class Republicans as well. Now, BitChute does get more traffic sort of in the middle, lower middle class, and lower class, if you will. You would maybe expect that with some of the language and things used there. There is also nationalist ideology of this type for high-class people to and even academically minded people. I give you the Claremont Institute. This is a much more slick-looking thing. The Claremont Institute goes back to the late 1970s, early 1980s. It's actually a registered think tank out of Southern California. It actually, the name Claremont comes from the Claremont colleges because back in the late 70s, early 80s, the people that started this were professors that are affiliated with Claremont colleges. It no longer has an official affiliation with the college consortium out there. Publications, scholars, programs, events, media, donate. This sounds like looks like a typical think tank, sort of academically minded thing, right? You've got your scholar pictures here, Lincoln Fellows 2021. The Claremont Institute is now fully a nationalist ideology think tank, and it puts out propaganda level sort of new academically minded pieces from nationalist academics. There are actually a few of them. I'll show you one here as the last example. The American Mind is a publication of the Claremont Institute. A standing professor of history at Hillsdale College up in Michigan, which is a sort of conservative-minded institution, wrote this. It became a very highly viewed sort of think piece. It had millions of views. Glenn Elmers is his name, the author. Conservatism is no longer enough. This is explicitly, in a more academic sense, defining the nationalist political movement on the right side as actually not traditional conservatism, but more specifically and explicitly a nationalist authoritarian movement. So there is a self-awareness, especially among the upper middle and upper class that delve into this stuff and believe it and propagate it, that they are explicitly saying this is not necessarily the founding fathers that were trying to, in their foundation of America that we're trying to reinstitute. It's actually something new and authoritarian. Glenn Elmers goes on to say from the Claremont Institute, this piece actually explicitly talks about two Americas and how people that do not vote Republican are essentially not really Americans, and about how we have to deal with them in some extra legal means or even in vigilante sort of ways. The United States has become two nations occupying the same country. It starts out here. Let's be blunt. So this actually, it has an academic name and institution behind it. And so this is like nationalism sort of for the for the higher educated, if you will. So we don't want to stereotype this political movement as just, among those that are not college educated or that are not necessarily, are maybe a little bit lower on the socioeconomic status and spectrum. We do have, and polling data and my own interview data shows this as well, we do have a decent percentage of upper middle class and upper class Republicans that are now fully in this nationalist ideology. Whether they're genuine about it or not, they want the outcomes and they're promoting them. And so you look at Republican donor class recently, you can see a lot of that movement sort of too going on among wealthier Republicans. So we want to keep that in mind as well. This ideology now goes across classes, and it has a whole range of media outlets, from sort of the stuff that goes really in the absolute explicit gutter to this more, streamlined sort of stuff that actually mimics, sort of academic writings with some citations and referencing legal scholars and all these sorts of more high-minded, if you will, sorts of methods and techniques. I talked longer than I wanted to. My goodness, I apologize, but I know we have an hour and a half for this. So let me stop yakking at you for now. Hopefully I've explained, and one of the points I think why we do this too, hopefully, is that this is obviously something that has been covered in the media a lot the past few years. I understand that. I studied it before then, but it's certainly become a big news item. And I'm sure, again, those of you that follow political news, which is some of you, have certainly heard about QAnon and read about the beliefs and that sort of stuff. One of the reasons why I want to do tonight in this series as well, and why I think it's important, is because hopefully as we go through these things, I want you, it's the job of a social scientist like me to start to get you into thinking about how the people that we're studying think, right? And what they consume. And that is, unfortunately, I don't think what a lot of journalism that covers this stuff and reports on this stuff is doing really well. It tends to profile the national level, federal level politicians and how they talk about it. But understand that the things that come out of the federal, congressional Republicans, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, others, they're actually crowdsourcing this stuff from the internet too. If you look at the origins of a lot of the conspiracy theories, there are great pieces now, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the site 538.com or some of these more mainstream media outlets. It's 538 is kind of a data-driven news and news website. They trace the origins of a lot of these nationalist conspiracy theories. They do an excellent sort of network analysis of these things. It turns out that politicians are just taking the crowdsourced stuff from BitChute and Liberty Daily and Gateway Pundit and all these things, and they're just mimicking what originates online. That's what Donald Trump was doing in 2015 and 2016, and again in throughout his entire time now in our political life. And so we oftentimes think too that politics is a top-down thing, that it's politicians shaping how people think. I really want us to start thinking about politics as a bottom-up process. And these conspiracy items, the origin points of them really are in extremist individuals online who post them, and then it gets a following, and then the politicians just mimic it themselves back to people that want to hear it. And that's the way this process works. So I think I'll stop there. We've covered a lot, and hopefully you have a good amount of time for discussion and questions. So let me stop there, and I guess I can give it back to Ellen.
Okay, so if you have a question, please put it in the chat. Please indicate your name. We'll probably, I think the way it's probably will work best is for Dr. Chapman to read the chat and answer questions rather than try to go to individuals.
That would be fine. Let me. Yes, of course. And I've got the chat. What is showing is my chat window up here too. So. Yes.
So we have Marty with his first question, and then we'll take it from there. Do it that way.
Okay. So I can go ahead and directly look at these and answer these. We already got a few coming in. Great. So let me try to take them one at a time. So Marty has a question. Thank you, Marty. The information you present is very discouraging and depressing. Do the trends that you have identified appear to be leading the U.S. to a situation where fascism becomes the dominant political domain? And also, what opportunity do you see for these trends to be reversed? Okay, so I am sorry, first of all, for the depressing news. I know this is, we have a lowering political mood in the country because of this. If you look at current polling data right now, this is actually something the American people broadly across the spectrum, across the political spectrum, including independent voters, are recognizing, meaning that over 50% of the American electorate now does recognize political extremism as a problem and political violence potentially as a problem. So this is something that is being perceived by a lot of Americans now, and Marty, I think you are too. So now I intersperse the term fascism. I want to be intensely careful, and we all should be intensely careful about how we use that term. I tried to use the term nationalism more so than I did fascism. Again, fascism is the extremist form of nationalism where, violence actually starts to occur in mass. Now, we are certainly not anywhere near that right now, okay, practically speaking, of course. Can we get there? The United States is now on Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is one of the most trusted, I would say least biased human rights organizations in the world. They do a lot of research on authoritarian countries, violent political rhetoric, violence against women and men, all these sorts of human rights, basic human rights issues. The United States has been upticked recently by Human Rights Watch as being on watch for violent political rhetoric, meaning it's no longer, if you're a politically healthy country and don't have a lot of extremism, you're not going to have any upticks in Human Rights Watch, okay? So this is something that serious people, serious scholars, and people that study this stuff for a living are also very concerned about. In the December 2nd talk, Marty, we're going to dive more into the polling data on this and see how large of a scope of the problem it is. Now, I won't force you to go to the December 2nd talk. Maybe we can briefly talk about it. I still need to run more of the numbers on this. They do fluctuate occasionally. I think we're generally, if you look at consistent random samples across the U.S. population of Republican registered voters, people that actually fully believe, meaning they believe all of the things I just talked about, all those principles, they're full in on it, like, 100%, 8 to 9 to 10% of the electorate is somewhere in that range, I would say. Now, that is obviously not insignificant, okay, and that does maybe scare us a little bit. Let me give you some better news. If we look across the U.S. electorate, of course, the majority of people, obviously, are fully pro-democracy. And they are more recognizing that this extremism is a problem, both on the left and on the right. It's going to take, it would take a significant amount of things for any sort of serious in mass violence to occur. We are not anywhere near that, okay? And I don't want to scare people and hallucinate people about that. But we do see, but the rhetoric is certainly there, isn't it, Marty? We saw examples of that. The speech about it is really fully there for the people, the millions of people, and likely tens of millions of people that do believe this. So if it continues to grow as a percentage of the population, then we can certainly get more problems. I think the more immediate problems that we have to deal with are more of these nationalist ideology type of problems, which is that, we need to try to implement authoritarianism. We need to try to decertify elections. These more political matters rather than violence matters, okay? We're still a long way again from that sort of, but we did see a violent insurrection, of course, on January 6th. We do have these occasions. But let's also have some optimism there. Whenever the United States or any state brings out National Guard, more military or police force, there's not much of a peak. There were supposed to be these other major rallies post-January 6th. They did not materialize at the federal level. And that's because we were ready with much more police presence, much more military presence, so on and so forth. Those that believe extremist nationalist ideologies, they may talk a big violent game, but they're really weak in some cases. They know where the forces are, and so if we have reasonable preparedness, we were not prepared at all on January 6th. I'm talking about police force, Capitol Police, that sort of stuff. It becomes a whimper, not a roar. So I think we need to focus more on, in the coming months and years, we need to focus more on our elections, on voting, on attempts at corruption in voting, and corruption generally, and those sorts of issues rather than the violence, if that makes sense. What opportunity do you see these trends to be reversed? Well, and we're going to talk about that, I think, more on January 27th. You're previewing the next two talks, I think, really well. This is a hard one, because when extremism becomes a larger proportion of the electorate, this becomes an en masse thing, right? It becomes a plurality of the electorate. And when it's beyond just, 5% or less, that's when any nation is politically healthy. We're always going to have conspiracy theorists and extremists. Any society will. I mean, that's as old as social scientists studying it. Every nation has that. But if we're politically healthy, and we've had this in U.S. history too before, where it's 5% or below that believe that, and they don't hold any political power when it's marginal percentage. But so it becomes really hard when you have political extremism. Look, one of the hardest things to do is to change people's minds on the two things you're not supposed to talk at the dinner table: politics and religion. And there's a ton of social science research that will show you when it's extremist ideology, nationalism, fascism, authoritarian socialism on the left too. You get those types of ideologies, it becomes even harder to convince someone to change their minds, okay? But there are some things, reframing conversations away from specific policy issues to more broader discussions about the nature of authoritarianism and, the founding of the United States and the principles of our country. It's going to be one of the things I'm going to talk about, I think, on January 27th, is that when we talk to people and engage people in conversation that have these beliefs, it's not going to do very much good to debate the really specific policy points that they're making. Oh, we don't want any immigrants in the country. We should shut them all off. Oh, we need to build a wall. Oh, all these sorts of, the vote count in Pennsylvania was wrong. These really more micro sort of issues. If we debate people on the sort of hyper specifics of all of these things, I submit to you that we're not going to get much anywhere. And you know why? Because guess what? These people have their evidence. They have a whole web, a whole ecosystem of these propaganda networks that we just looked a little bit at online. That is the news they trust. And they are completely, in some cases, in that world. And so every specific point that you make is just going to be pushed back by, well, my source says this and I believe this source. If you reframe conversations around broader points of, let's talk about authoritarianism, or let's talk about, and again, I'll specify that more in a future talk, but I think we need to start reframing conversations more rather than debating specific policy points with people, because in the end, because the news is so segregated now, I submit to you that you're not going to get much anywhere, unfortunately, with a lot of people debating those really specific sort of policy type issues. And a lot of this, as you can see, is not even based on policy. It's based on this belief that there's a conspiracy against those people. And so, that's a hard thing to break through. So hopefully I'm starting to answer your question. Rich has a question here. Do you draw any distinctions between white nationalism, white power, and white supremacy? I'm drawing on Kathleen Blue's ideas with this question. Well, a broader point before I maybe more specifically answer that, Rich. We've been talking, again, broadly here about nationalist ideology among Republicans. Okay. I do want to point out that there is a decent, this is not specific just to European descent whites in the United States as well. We do see a double-digit percentage across many ethnic groups, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, others, that do hold the nationalist ideology set that I just presented to you. Now, that may surprise some folks, but look, you can go around. We have plenty even political candidates running for federal Senate, federal House, state Senate, state House across the country right now. We've got elections coming up. And you will find Hispanic candidates and black candidates too, and those representing this ideology. So now, of course, the majority of it is European descent whites. But nationalism more broadly in the United States now is not purely exclusive to one ethnic group. Now that there is a intensely deep irony there, of course, because there's a good amount of the rhetoric that is white nationalist in the nationalist ideology, right? So I mean, it is, this gets into a lot of contradictions, and how could somebody who's not white, believe an ideology like that, and so on. This is what happens when you have low political knowledge, folks. A lot of people in the country don't know almost anything about politics and our political history and our founding. And when you have, so we tend to see, this can happen when you don't have a lot of understanding about how politics in the country works. Okay. So white nationalism, white power, white supremacy. It's not necessarily my specific research area, Rich. I do cover it some and do analyze it some because it is a part of this broader nationalist ideology. I would reframe this a little bit more to maybe refocus on sort of the broader electorate, and here's why. The most violent expressive, one of the most violent expressive public displays of this ideology was the January 6th insurrection, right? I think we can generally agree on that. We have excellent survey data of the hundreds of people that have been arrested from that insurrection that day. There are about 700-800 of them. University of Chicago studies have done this, really excellent work. Published peer-reviewed stuff. Over 90% of the people that were in the insurrection were not paramilitant group affiliated. They were not part of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, these more explicit white nationalist, white power groups. Moreover, over 90% of the insurrectionists were just essentially ordinary citizens ranging from mid-20s to 70-year-olds, real estate agents, state elected officials, medical doctors. We have a whole, construction workers. It was a whole range across classes and across socioeconomic status if I wanted to draw a random sample of just demographics from the United States, at least maybe on the white side of the spectrum, it actually represented that pretty decently. So it's, and again, that's a explicit, going into the Capitol and trying to overthrow the United States government. And this was mostly regular citizens. So I certainly appreciate the white nationalist questions, and I do understand obviously where they're coming from, and they are important, of course. But I would recommend to us as well going beyond that sort of mindset a little bit too, and understanding this ideology. And I'm not saying that you don't. It sounds like you do, but just to say that we need to think about this more as a sort of in mass sort of movement, which I'm sorry to say that it is. But there are certainly elements of white nationalism in this, Rich. It is a, there is this, there is a basis of this that, like German nationalism was, that there is an ethnic group that represents the nation that has Anglo-American values. You can hear, you can see on the news sites, the media sites, and also even the elected federal politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert as examples that represent this ideology, that talk about Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-American values, right? Those, that's about as explicit white nationalist ideology as you can get. So there are contradictions in here. There are people that are not white that are a part of it, but there's still elements in it. So it can sometimes be a mix of that, Rich. But it really is, as a mass movement, morphing into something beyond white nationalism, and that's one of the messages I want to try to get across. Ellen, that was Paula, excuse me. How much of a role does racism play? I would sort of, going along with maybe the answer to Rich too, racism is a part of it, but I would also, there are more important things in this ideology to people than that. Look, some of the most supported state candidates that represent this movement are people like Alan West in Texas, who are African Americans. I remind you that in the 2015 Republican primary, the only person after Donald Trump entered the race that held the lead in that race was a black man, Ben Carson. And these were people that became nationalists through that time period. I think the racism does get a little bit more play as a part of this ideology than it should. Now, there is obviously those elements of it. We saw BitChute, for example. My goodness, that is explicit racism. But that's the more extreme end of the extreme, if you will. Again, this has grown into something that has enveloped a lot more of what have been historically Republican voters and some new Republican voters that used to be sort of Union Democrats in the lesser educated parts of the demographics there. And you know, they are yes, they may hold some you know, less than favorable views sometimes of minority groups, but it's not the driving force. Let's put it that way. The driving force really is the fundamental factor here, folks, of all of this is a hatred of the other party. I'm sorry to use the term hate, but that is, I think, an accurate description of it. It is those that are now Republicans hating Democrats. That's the main thing. It cuts much more across party affiliation now than ethnicity or class, and so that's the way I would suggest that we think about it. Lois, who takes your courses? Does your class discussions ever become heated? I don't. This is my recent research area of the past 4 or 5 years. I became concerned about it like a lot of other academics did and social scientists did. There's been an uptick in this type of research, surprise, because we are generally concerned about it. And I thought that there wasn't enough portrayal of the actual people that believe it. And so I'm working on my sort of ethnographic interviews and interviewing people that hold these beliefs. I don't necessarily talk a lot about this in my courses. I do sometimes in my sociology classes where political sociology sort of overlaps. I think a lot of young people, I get a lot of traditional 18 to 22-year-olds at Rowan College over in Mount Laurel. And I mean, they're from Cinnaminson and all across Burlington County, of course. We represent the county and neighboring counties too. I get that a lot of the young people are already tired of this. You know, maybe some of them are taking in the negative partisanship beliefs. Again, I cited studies earlier that do show that consistently now. But either way, I also get a lot of sense that they don't like what's going on. They think their elders are behaving like children, and they're sick of it in many ways. And a lot of times, if I bring it up, they're kind of like, eh. When before, maybe like 3-4 years ago, if I were to talk about political issues, I would get more like, yeah, let's talk about this. They're like, oh, let's not, you know, because it's getting a little exhausting for them, I think, and so that's just my perception. I don't have actual. I file this under speculation, my own eyeball test. I don't have any official data on that. Okay, but that's my sense anyway. And I get a good cross section of my college. I get 300 plus students each semester in many different majors. So. Maybe, Ellen, do we have time for a few more questions? I know we have up to 8:30. Is that okay, or what should we do? I can answer 1 or 2 more. Or
I think, can you hear me? Yes. I think you can answer 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, what else? Let's see, Arlen G here. I want to discuss the role of educators to help students understand critical thinking to combat these ridiculous views. In the 60s, it was the young people who led the way in understanding how to think and evaluate what the media was saying. We need much more media literacy in our K-12 and also our higher education. Arlene, if you can start a campaign, I will donate to it and you know, fully support you. This is something I'm actually trying to do at Rowan College as well. We don't necessarily have a lot of this. If you look at broad surveys across traditional college-age students. There was an excellent study done just a few years ago. Public universities, public community colleges, big random sample, really nice research. 60 to 70% of college students across public, private universities and community colleges, big, nice random sample, 60 to 70% are consistently saying they cannot tell the difference between fake news and real news. That's a serious problem. I mean, we have solid data that literally a majority of our young people cannot consistently tell the difference. And let's say something else. 75 to 80% of the news consumption for college-age students is happening online. Now, yes, they read the New York Times online, the Washington Post online, and that sort of stuff. But they also get a lot of Facebook feed, and if it's going to be called Meta, I don't know what it's going to be called next. There's some rebranding going on there, maybe. But they are consuming stuff online, and they don't know what to believe sometimes. We need to systematically teach our young people how to discern what constitutes evidence for things. If I can get our colleges and K-12 educators, if I could say one statement to them, that would be it. We have to we have to do a much better and focused job systematically of teaching our population broadly what constitutes reliable and accurate evidence to understand what you're looking at. One of the major problems of this is just unclear and lazy thinking. If you go and if we were to deep dive into some of these conspiracy theories, I mean, they're so constantly contradictory. And if you think about the things for more than just a few minutes, you realize how such a deep conspiracy just is not possible. I mean, it would take conspiracies of almost every institution in the world to operate such a thing. We have a lot of our population, unfortunately, that cannot consistently rationally think or also understand what really constitutes evidence for the things that they're looking at. So we need education, in K-12 and college more broadly as a gen ed or that sort of thing, general education requirement about media literacy, about how to discern evidence and and those sorts of things. Maybe one more quickly, if I can. What a lot of different demographics, Roberts. What is driving people to believe in these theories? What is the predominant makeup? Middle class, white, middle aged. It's across the class spectrum now, and it is even across ethnic groups. So that's an excellent preview for our December 2nd talk. We will look at again the scope of this problem, the numbers behind it, and how wide and how deep it is. Lack of civic education, yes, Esther, that is, I think, going along with Arlene's point. Yeah, that's we definitely need more robust civic education too. So these are things to talk about at your school board, as long as you don't have nationalists there trying to stop mask mandates and that sort of stuff. I'm sorry to throw in a bad joke at the end, but that is stuff that is legitimately happening right now too. Nationalists are going into school boards, and you've probably seen that on the news as well. So education is becoming, and by the way, they're going into those places because they think they can have power there. It's going to the local level, and so it's something where we may folks that maybe wouldn't be politically active otherwise, we may have to get a little bit politically active. Us moderates out there and those reasonably pro-democracy and reasonable thinking people. This, with the rise of extremism, it's one of those things where, we need a more explicit pro-democracy coalition, and even in our politicians too. It's something I would certainly like as well. We need to start thinking about how to vote that way and vote for ethical and moderate people. So that's something I talk to people a lot about as well. I think we're about at time here, Ellen, so I don't want to keep people too long. I can give it back to you. Again, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, folks, for the questions. This has been a wonderful, hopefully a wonderful session. It's been educational for me too with the questions you have. They're always excellent.